I can't believe she's gone. I know. It was so sudden. We need to be strong.
The rain had not stopped since morning. It rolled down the black windows of the funeral home in heavy streaks, while two grown men stood near the entrance trying to whisper without sounding angry. But grief has a way of making people louder than they realize, especially when money is involved. 38-year-old Adam Carter kept pacing across the marble floor with his jaw clenched, so tightly it looked painful. His younger brother Daniel sat motionless in a chair near the hallway, staring at the framed photographs of their mother arranged beside white roses and candles. Eleanor Carter smiled from every frame with the same soft expression she always wore in pictures, the kind that made strangers trust her instantly. But that morning neither of her sons looked at her photographs with love. They looked at them like accusations. 10 minutes earlier, a lawyer had placed a sealed envelope on the table and quietly informed them that their mother's estate had already been distributed according to her final wishes. Most of the money was gone. The lake house was gone. The investment accounts were gone. And the two boys she once worked 18-hour shifts to raise had been left with almost nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain outside. Adam was the first to speak. He called her bitter, then cruel, then heartless. Daniel said nothing at all, because deep down he already feared there was a reason this had happened. And the frightening part was that he was beginning to realize he might already know what that reason was, because nobody in that funeral home was talking about the 11 birthdays Eleanor spent alone. Nobody mentioned the phone calls that went unanswered, or the Christmas presents returned unopened. Nobody talked about the hospital nights where she stared at the door, hoping her sons would walk through it just once before it became too late. The story everyone saw began with a will, but the real story started years earlier inside a marriage that slowly tore an entire family apart, one conversation at a time. And by the time Adam and Daniel finally came back into their mother's life, Eleanor Carter was already gone. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always love hearing from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story is not only about inheritance, it is about loyalty, resentment, silence, and the kind of heartbreak that leaves scars people carry for decades without anyone noticing. Long before lawyers and funerals entered the picture, Eleanor Carter was known as the woman who never stopped moving. She lived in a quiet town outside Milwaukee, where winters were cold enough to freeze the edges of the lake behind their home every January. People in the neighborhood remembered her as the mother who attended every school play, even after working overnight hospital shifts. She was the woman who baked cupcakes at 2 in the morning because one of her sons forgot to mention a classroom party until the last second. Her hands were always busy, folding laundry, packing lunches, paying bills at the kitchen counter while everyone else slept. When Adam and Daniel were younger, they adored her completely. Adam used to wait near the front window every evening just to watch her pull into the driveway after work. Daniel once cried at school because another student said nurses were scary, and he spent an entire afternoon defending his mother to children twice his size. Back then, the Carter family looked ordinary from the outside. Richard Carter coached Little League on weekends and grilled burgers during summer cookouts, while Eleanor sat nearby smiling at conversations she barely had energy to follow. Their house was loud, warm, and full of life. At least that was the version everyone else saw. But families rarely collapse overnight. Most of the time the damage begins quietly in small moments people dismiss too easily. Richard had a habit of correcting Eleanor in front of the boys. If she told a story, he interrupted to improve it. If she forgot something, he laughed a little too hard before pointing it out. Sometimes the boys laughed with him because children naturally follow the emotional direction of whichever parent seems stronger in the moment. Eleanor usually stayed quiet afterward. She would lower her eyes toward her plate and continue eating as if nothing happened. At first, those moments seemed harmless, but over time they became part of the atmosphere inside the home. Richard controlled conversations without raising his voice. He made Eleanor appear overly emotional whenever arguments started, and slowly, almost invisibly, the boys learned to see their father as the reasonable parent and their mother as the difficult one whenever tension appeared. Eleanor noticed it happening years before anyone else did. She just never imagined how far it would eventually go. The first real crack appeared during Adam's senior year of high school. Richard had begun spending more time away from home, claiming he needed extra hours at work because business was struggling. Eleanor believed him for months until overdue notices started appearing in the mailbox, despite the fact that she was still working double shifts every week. One afternoon, she discovered a second credit card statement hidden inside Richard's desk drawer. Then another. Then evidence of loans she knew nothing about. Tens of thousands of dollars had disappeared without explanation. When she confronted him privately, Richard reacted with calm disbelief instead of anger. That frightened her more than shouting would have. He told her she was overreacting. He reminded her how exhausted she always was from work. He suggested maybe she had forgotten conversations they supposedly already had. By the end of the argument, Eleanor found herself apologizing, even though she had uncovered the truth. That night, Adam overheard part of the fight from upstairs. Richard sat with him alone and explained that his mother had been stressed lately and was creating problems where none existed. It was a small conversation, quiet, casual, but it mattered, because from that point forward, Adam started watching his mother differently. Every emotional reaction became evidence that his father might be right about her. Daniel noticed the tension too, but unlike his brother, he still clung closely to Eleanor during those years. She was the one helping with homework and staying awake through fevers, while Richard disappeared for long stretches claiming work emergencies. Yet even Daniel slowly absorbed the emotional current running through the house. Richard never openly attacked Eleanor in front of the boys. He simply planted doubts and allowed them to grow on their own. That was what made him effective. Years later, Daniel would struggle to explain exactly when his relationship with his mother began changing, because there was never one explosive moment. It happened through repetition, through silence, through little comments that seemed harmless until they became permanent beliefs. Then came the affair. Eleanor discovered it by accident after Richard left his phone charging on the kitchen counter before showering one evening. The message itself was short, almost ordinary. A woman asking if he could stay another night because she missed him already. Eleanor read the sentence 3 times before the meaning fully settled into her chest. 24 years of marriage collapsed inside her in complete silence. She did not scream when Richard came downstairs. She simply handed him the phone and asked how long it had been happening. Richard looked annoyed more than ashamed. That was the moment Eleanor understood something terrifying. He had already emotionally left the marriage long before she discovered the truth. The confrontation lasted hours. Voices rose. Doors slammed. Adam came downstairs halfway through the argument and immediately sided with his father before understanding any details. Richard framed the affair as a consequence of Eleanor's emotional distance. He blamed her work schedule, her exhaustion, her constant stress, and because Eleanor was devastated and crying, while Richard remained composed, the boys unconsciously interpreted him as more believable. People often trust the calmer person during conflict, even when that person caused the damage. That night, Daniel sat beside his mother while she cried in the laundry room, but even he asked quietly whether she could forgive his father so things would return to normal. Eleanor realized then that her children were already beginning to fear disruption more than dishonesty. Within 6 months, the divorce process officially began, and that was when the real separation started, not between husband and wife, between mother and sons. Divorce changes the emotional gravity inside families. Children, even adult children, often feel pressured to choose emotional territory. Richard understood this immediately. He rented a downtown apartment with modern furniture, expensive electronics, and complete freedom from household rules. The boys were young enough to enjoy it and old enough to resent the tension at their mother's house. Eleanor, meanwhile, became consumed by legal bills, debt, and overtime shifts. Her exhaustion deepened. Conversations with the boys turned shorter and more strained. Adam especially grew colder every month. He blamed Eleanor for making the divorce difficult, even though Richard had caused it. Richard never directly told the boys to abandon their mother. He simply encouraged narratives that painted himself as the injured party. He complained about alimony payments while taking them on vacations. He sighed dramatically whenever Eleanor called during family dinners. Sometimes he would say things like, "Your mother always needs something," before answering the phone. Small comments, constant repetition. Over time, those comments shaped reality. Adam stopped visiting regularly first. Then birthdays became shorter. Holidays became divided. Daniel held on longer, but even he gradually pulled away after college began. Eleanor tried desperately to keep traditions alive. She mailed care packages, sent long text messages, asked about exams, girlfriends, apartments, jobs. The replies became shorter every year. Sometimes weeks passed without responses. She kept telling herself it was temporary. Young men become busy, she thought. They will come back eventually. But loneliness has a dangerous way of stretching time. Before Eleanor realized it, entire seasons had passed without hearing her son's voices. The first Christmas alone nearly broke her completely. Eleanor still decorated the house exactly as she always had. She cooked too much food, wrapped gifts carefully, even bought Daniel the expensive watch he once mentioned, wanting months earlier. Adam texted that he would stop by after dinner at Richard's house. Daniel promised to visit before midnight. Neither arrived. Eleanor sat beside the Christmas tree until almost 2 in the morning, before finally turning off the lights. The next afternoon, she found the gifts still sitting untouched beneath the tree, exactly where she left them. A week later, the packages she mailed to their apartments were returned unopened, because both boys had apparently traveled with their father and his new wife during the holidays. Eleanor carried those boxes into her bedroom and cried so hard, she became physically sick afterward. Yet when coworkers asked how her Christmas went, she smiled politely and said the boys were busy traveling. Pride often prevents lonely people from admitting how abandoned they feel. Over the following years, the pattern repeated in increasingly painful ways. Missed birthdays, canceled dinners, ignored voicemails. Once Eleanor drove nearly 4 hours to attend Adam's business presentation after he reluctantly invited her at the last minute. She sat alone in the audience while Adam introduced Richard proudly to colleagues afterward, without acknowledging her presence. She left before the event ended because she suddenly understood she was becoming invisible inside her own children's lives. That realization changes people permanently. By the 7th year after the divorce, Eleanor stopped expecting phone calls. That was the year she developed the habit of eating dinner in silence beside the television because the quiet inside the house became unbearable otherwise. Friends encouraged her to date again, but she refused every suggestion. Part of her still believed repairing her relationship with her sons mattered more than building a new life. She attended therapy privately and began slowly understanding the emotional manipulation that had occurred over decades. Her therapist once asked when she last felt emotionally chosen by her children. Eleanor could not answer immediately. After several minutes, she realized the truthful answer was probably when they were still the boys. That realization haunted her for weeks. Meanwhile, Richard continued positioning himself as the dependable parent despite rarely carrying the emotional burdens Eleanor handled throughout their childhoods. Adam admired him deeply by then. Daniel remained conflicted. Sometimes he called unexpectedly after drinking and spoke to Eleanor for hours about childhood memories. During those conversations, she glimpsed pieces of the little boy who once waited by the front window for her every evening. But the next morning, distance always returned. Daniel never confronted his father directly. He simply avoided difficult conversations entirely. That avoidance would later become the source of enormous guilt. Then something happened nobody expected. Eleanor inherited 40 acres of undeveloped land from an elderly aunt in Colorado. At first, the property seemed nearly worthless, but within 3 years, a commercial development project dramatically increased its value. Suddenly, Eleanor possessed more money than anyone in the family realized. She paid off debts quietly, renovated parts of her home, donated anonymously to local charities, and for the first time since the divorce, she stopped living in survival mode. What makes this detail important is that her sons knew nothing about it. Richard especially assumed Eleanor remained financially unstable after the divorce, because she never discussed money publicly. During this same period, Eleanor began rebuilding pieces of herself that had disappeared during marriage and motherhood. She volunteered at hospice centers, joined a small book club, took painting classes on Thursday evenings. People around her noticed she laughed more often, though sadness still lingered underneath almost every interaction. There is a particular kind of loneliness experienced by parents estranged from their children. It never fully leaves the body. It simply learns how to sit quietly beside other emotions. One October afternoon, Eleanor received a diagnosis that changed everything again. The illness was treatable but serious enough to force difficult conversations about the future. For the first time in years, she reached out repeatedly to both sons, hoping fear might reopen emotional doors that pride had kept closed. Adam responded politely but distantly. He claimed work responsibilities made travel difficult. Daniel answered less consistently, but sounded genuinely shaken when he learned she was ill. Eleanor invited both boys to dinner several times over the following months. Most invitations were declined. Once Daniel promised to come but canceled 30 minutes beforehand because Richard unexpectedly needed help with something. Eleanor never argued anymore when disappointments happened. She simply said she understood. People often mistake quiet acceptance for emotional strength when sometimes it is only exhaustion. During one hospital stay after complications from treatment, Eleanor spent 4 nights alone, except for nurses who checked her vitals every few hours. She kept glancing toward the door whenever footsteps approached in the hallway. Nobody came. One nurse later recalled Eleanor, staring at her phone for long stretches without touching it, as if waiting for courage from the other side of silence. The heartbreaking truth was that Eleanor still wanted reconciliation more than revenge even then. She would have forgiven almost everything if her sons had sincerely returned. The decision regarding the will happened late, one winter evening after another missed visit. Daniel had promised to stop by with his girlfriend after work. Eleanor baked his favorite pie from scratch and waited for hours. Eventually, a text arrived saying something came up and they would reschedule soon. Eleanor sat at the untouched pie on her kitchen counter long after midnight. The following morning, she called her attorney and requested a private appointment. The lawyer later admitted Eleanor seemed calm during the meeting, almost strangely peaceful. She explained exactly how she wanted her estate divided. Significant portions would fund scholarships for nursing students and support domestic abuse shelters. Smaller amounts would go toward local community programs and healthcare charities. The lake house would be transferred to the hospice centers whose nurses treated her with kindness during treatment. Adam and Daniel would each receive personal letters along with enough money to avoid legal complications, but nothing resembling inheritance wealth. Before finalizing documents, the attorney asked whether she wanted time to reconsider. Eleanor reportedly sat silent for nearly a minute before quietly saying, "I spent years begging my children to love me back. I'm done begging now." That sentence stayed with the attorney long after Eleanor left his office, because beneath the calmness was a level of heartbreak difficult to describe. She was not punishing her sons for one mistake. She was responding to more than a decade of emotional abandonment. Months later, Eleanor's condition worsened rapidly. Daniel visited once during the final weeks after repeated encouragement from his girlfriend. The meeting was painfully awkward. They spoke mostly about weather and work, because neither knew how to address the enormous emotional distance between them. At one point, Eleanor asked whether he remembered the camping trip where he got lost near the lake as a child. Daniel laughed softly and said he remembered being terrified until she found him. Eleanor smiled sadly before replying, "I never stopped looking for you after that either." Daniel did not fully understand the meaning until much later. Adam never visited at all before her death. He sent flowers and brief messages through relatives. But emotionally, he remained aligned with Richard, who still insisted Eleanor exaggerated illness for attention. When Eleanor passed away quietly one rainy Tuesday morning, the hospital contacted both sons immediately. Daniel cried in his car for nearly an hour after hearing the news. Adam reacted with stunned silence before immediately asking about funeral arrangements and estate details. Grief reveals priorities people usually hide from themselves. At the funeral, old friends and former co-workers filled nearly every seat inside the chapel. Adam and Daniel appeared genuinely shocked listening to story after story, describing kindnesses their mother performed quietly for years. A former patient described Eleanor paying for medication she could not afford. Another woman recalled Eleanor spending entire nights comforting families after devastating diagnoses. The boys sat there, realized strangers seemed to know deeper parts of their mother than they did. That realization unsettled Daniel profoundly. After the service ended, people lined up for nearly an hour sharing memories, while Adam grew increasingly irritated about the delayed will readings scheduled afterward. And then came the moment that changed everything. Inside the attorney's office, the details emerged slowly. The charities, the donations, the scholarship fund established in Eleanor's name. Adam interrupted repeatedly, demanding clarification, until finally the attorney explained there was no misunderstanding. Their mother had made her decisions carefully and legally years earlier. Adam exploded in anger. He accused Eleanor of manipulation even in death. He called the entire thing a performance designed to humiliate them publicly. Daniel barely spoke because his attention remained fixed on 2 sealed envelopes placed separately beside the documents. One contained his name written carefully in Eleanor's handwriting. The other belonged to Adam. Their mother's final words waited inside those envelopes while rain battered the office windows outside. Adam opened his letter first. His expression hardened almost immediately while reading. He finished quickly before tossing the paper onto the table in disgust. Daniel hesitated longer before unfolding his own. Eleanor's handwriting shook slightly across the page from illness, but every sentence felt painfully clear. She wrote about missing the little boy who used to run into her arms after school. She admitted her mistakes openly. She apologized for moments when exhaustion made her emotionally unavailable during childhood. But she also wrote something Daniel would never forget for the rest of his life. I kept every voicemail you ever left me because sometimes hearing your voice was the only thing that helped me through entire weeks. Daniel had to stop reading after the sentence because tears blurred the page completely. Meanwhile, Adam refused to cry at all. He focused entirely on the financial aspect, insisting Eleanor had been manipulated by outsiders during illness. Over the following weeks, he contacted multiple attorneys exploring ways to challenge the will. None found legitimate grounds. Eleanor had documented everything thoroughly. The more Adam fought the situation, the more bitter he became. Daniel moved in the opposite direction. Guilt began consuming him slowly. He started revisiting memories from childhood and recognizing patterns he ignored for years. He remembered how often his father mocked Eleanor subtly. He remembered phone calls he never returned, birthdays forgotten, invitations declined. He realized reconciliation had always required effort from both sides, and most of that effort had come from his mother alone. Several months after the funeral, Daniel visited Eleanor's old house for the first time since her death. The property had not yet been sold, and walking through it felt strangely unbearable. Everything remained organized exactly as she left it. Her reading glasses still rested beside the living room chair. Magnets covered the refrigerator with old photographs and handwritten reminders. Inside a hallway closet, Daniels discovered carefully labeled storage boxes filled with childhood drawings, school awards, birthday cards, and every letter he and Adam had written as children. Eleanor had saved everything. At the bottom of one box, Daniel found a small calendar with handwritten notes scattered across different dates. One entry near the end caught his attention immediately. Daniel's favorite pie if he visits Sunday. The date was circled. Daniel remembered canceling that dinner at the last minute. The realization hit him so hard he had to sit down on the floor, because suddenly the story stopped being about inheritance entirely. It became about all the moments his mother kept choosing him, even after he stopped choosing her back. That kind of regret changes people forever. Today, stories like Eleanor Carter's spark fierce debates online and across dinner tables everywhere. Some people believe parents should forgive their children no matter what happens. Others argue abandonment has consequences regardless of blood. But perhaps the most painful part of this story is that reconciliation remained possible until the very end. Eleanor never truly wanted revenge. What she wanted was acknowledgement, effort. Love returned with the same consistency she gave it for decades. Instead, she spent 11 years setting places at the table for people who rarely arrived. And when her sons finally realized the depth of what they lost, they were standing beside a coffin instead of a dinner table. In the end, Eleanor did not remove her sons from the will because she hated them. She removed them because somewhere along the way she understood a devastating truth. Love alone cannot keep relationships alive when only one person keeps reaching across the distance. So now we want to ask you something important. Did Eleanor make the right decision? Or should parents forgive their children no matter how deeply they've been hurt? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.